Uh, Thank you very much, Cahirla, for facilitating me, and I really welcome the opportunity to speak on this piece of legislation. I welcome the bill, which is designed to facilitate direct recapitalisation of banks by the ESM, but I'm sure you will agree with me, Minister, that while it's welcome, it in no way goes to achieve the separation of banking and sovereign debt that we are all working towards and is at this stage long awaited. As other speakers have stated, €60 billion is a drop in the ocean in terms of the potential capital losses banks faced during the crisis, and so there will be a requirement for a much greater capital injection in due course. Otherwise, the European banking system will continue to remain exposed. Leaving aside the actual size of the bailout fund, the absence of a clearly defined role where elected governments can bring greater democratic accountability to the European Central Bank is of major concern. It's something that has been of huge concern to me for many years. The whole issue of a lack of transparency in the European Central Bank. It's something that I highlighted when I was a Minister of State and will continue to highlight. It's something that is deeply uncomfortable for some Member States, but I believe that Ireland should have a very, very clear position on this, which as yet the government does not have. And if it requires treaty change, Minister, it's something that we should be courageous enough to pursue, because transparency and openness within the ECB and for Member States is absolutely critical, and it does not exist at present. If a bank faces a liquidity crisis, as we know was the original issue in Allied Irish Bank and in the Bank of Cyprus, the European Central Bank has a facility to allow domestic central banks to essentially print money for that bank to ensure that it has enough cash to meet its liabilities. This does not improve the capital position of the bank, and it's supposed to be a short-term measure. The old maxim that if you owe the bank €100, that's your problem. If you owe the bank €100 million, that's the bank's problem. Well, I think that that particular maxim needs to be extended. And I think the additional line could read that if the bank owes the European Central Bank 1,000 million, then that's your country's problem. With the right hand, the European Central Bank has the power to prevent a liquidity crisis, crucial and a very powerful capacity, but with the left hand, by threatening to withdraw that wall of liquidity, it can then cause a capital crisis for the bank and, by extension, for the country or the member state. The charade of the European Central Bank operating independently from governments must come to an end, because it is a charade. And if that requires an EU treaty, as I said, in order to change it, then so be it. The people have a right to know what background deals are being done, what outside pressures are being imposed or applied by the most powerful unelected entity in the continent. A perfect example of this is a story in the Irish Times earlier this week that the central bank had begun the process of an accelerated sale of Irish government bonds, which it holds as a result of the promissory note deal negotiated by the Minister. The paper itself presented this as a remarkably good news story because of the immediate capital gains which the central bank stood to make from selling bonds into a market where Irish bonds have become so highly valued. It made little mention in that article of the fact that the interest rate which the Exchequer, or the taxpayer, is paying out annually on these bonds, for as long as they are held in the central bank balance sheet, are coming back in a circular motion to coffers of the state. So once sold, the burden on the Exchequer, in fact, increases. I find it far too much of a coincidence that this story comes about only weeks after Mario Draghi expressed a view that the early repayment of IMF bonds could be conditional on an accelerated sale of the promissory note government bonds. This IMF deal was heralded as saving the taxpayers €400 million a year, but what we don't know yet is how much more taxpayers will have to pay on debt servicing because the ECB forced the central bank into an accelerated sale of its government bonds. We don't even know if this was a condition of the IMF agreement, because so much of the negotiation between the government and the European Central Bank is done in utter secrecy, and is underpinned by no legislation and not really even any clear treaty framework. Precisely the same scenario applies to the tool which will be created by this legislation in terms of direct recapitalisation. All of these laws won't be worth the paper that they're written on, so long as the European Central Bank remains completely unaccountable in all scenarios to elected governments, but in practice operates secretive negotiation and enormous leverage over all countries, large and small. As we learned from a disclosure from former President Nicolas Sarkozy recently during a TV debate, he told the French people live on television that he and Chancellor Merkel had essentially put pressure on Mario Draghi to announce a programme of long-term lending to Eurozone banks, which at least for a year and probably longer, stabilised the Eurozone and prevented Spain and Italy from being forced into a bailout programme. So clearly political intervention can have positive effects, but the fact is, that the reality is that we need to know about it and it should be transparent, and as it stands it's not. Similarly, when Mario Draghi announced his famous he'd do whatever it takes statement to preserve the euro, which has long provided provided long-term stability to the eurozone, even to today. We now know that months of private negotiations between the ECB and Berlin and Paris had been taking place. Again, it was completely secretive. Other member states not involved, excluded, and particularly those most affected by it, and that is completely undemocratic and unaccountable. Small countries obviously have the least amount of power over the ECB. In fact, they have virtually no power. And if their banks go bust, as we have learned at great expense in this country, it's the sovereign that takes the hit. This legislation, unfortunately, will do nothing really to alter that reality. In a larger country, if its banks are facing the wall, the ECB will step in to help them without a huge amount of conditionality. It is realpolitik. This is the ECB's power and influence, and unless the treaties reflect this reality, small countries will continue to bear the brunt of it and ultimately to suffer now and in the future. I will be supporting this bill because I believe that it is in Europe's and this country's interest that we create a coherent European structure to bail out financial institutions which have a realistic chance of survival. We desperately need that capacity. I equally believe that in a single currency system, risks should be shared and mutualised, irrespective of size or relative economic power of that country. It's crucial in a monetary union that there is such burden sharing. I'm not quite sure where the government stands in that respect. I do think that Minister Noonan, made some utterances in that regard maybe 18 months ago, but I haven't heard a whole lot since. But I suppose, in a nutshell, the point that I want to make in addressing this legislation at second stage is, I suppose, my fear that in the absence of binding structures to define the relationship between the European Central Bank and the EU member states, binding structures in treaty format, which is how it really has to be done, during these types of crisis scenarios, as we have experienced in Ireland, the little country will again and again and again be the loser in such a process. And I think we, as a country that is held in good standing across the European Union, I think we have a moral obligation not only to our own people, but also to the other small member states of the European Union and vulnerable member states and peripheral member states. We have a responsibility to fight for transparency in the European Central Bank, and I would dearly love to hear somebody within government articulate that point, argue that case, and do it with conviction on behalf of the Irish people. Thank you.